Hey, I'm Ben. Singapore's history from the start of the Second World War to its independence sees an ever-changing political landscape and the creation of a new identity. To help us understand this time, I'll tell its story in 8 artifacts. While the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they simultaneously invaded Malaya and bombed Singapore. The invasion of Southeast Asia was sparked by a need for natural resources for their failing war in China. With a mechanized army of tanks and bicycles, the Japanese army would overrun Malaya in just 70 days. Despite having been dubbed impenetrable, with the world's largest dry dock and many fortifications, the British would surrender Singapore after a week of fighting. In the days after the surrender, an estimated 2,500 men would be executed in Operation Tsukching. The ration card and banana note helped tell the story of Singapore's time under Japanese rule. Ration cards would control everything from movement to meat to storage. Due to a lack of trade and stockpiling by the Japanese army, food shortages were constant. Most would queue from 3 or 4 in the morning in the hopes of getting their ever-shrinking rations. Shortages got worse by the banana note, nicknamed for the banana tree on its cover. While intended to be worth as much as the previous straight dollar, overprinting quickly led to hyperinflation. It would cost 5,000 yen for just 60 kilograms of rice by the end of the war, something that had once cost 30 cents. To survive, many would begin to grow their own crops and turn to the black market. Instead of using valueless notes, valuable items such as silverware or clothes would be the currency of choice. The war would end on the island when the Japanese would sign this document 2 weeks after their surrender in Tokyo. While many would initially cheer the return of the British, conditions stayed harsh, rationing would continue, and the economy was in a poor state. Anti-colonialist beliefs grew among the people. As only 5% of the population could vote in 1948, many would take to the streets. The largest political group on the island were the Chinese working class. Many were unhappy with British rule. This discontent was worsened by the establishment of communist rule in China, which saw the rise of the Malay Communist Party. These factors would lead to 2 political crises, the National Service riots and the Hockley riots. The former would be instigated by the National Service Ordinance Act, a law which made all male aged 18 to 20 serve part-time in the British Army. This was protested by Chinese students for 2 key reasons. Firstly, the students felt that the British were simply their colonial overlords who paid nothing for their education but now expected them to serve in their army. The second reason was a fear of having to fight communism in northern Malaya. Both can be seen in this open letter. It shows the British forcing these students to fight and kill their own people. This letter also shows that some of these students had communist sympathies with the line "Long live the Malay Communist Party." After 3 petitions had failed, hundreds began to protest on the streets. After refusing to disband, things would get violent, with the police using water pressure. A week later, 2,500 students would lock themselves into their school in a further attempt to protest the law, but were forced out the next morning. All of these protests would lead to the law being postponed. To understand the Hockley riots, one needs to see how Singapore changed in 1955. 1955 was the first year where elections were held where the majority of the population could vote. The party that the British expected to win was the Progress Party, which was also the one that was most politically aligned with them. They made no promise of independence or even self-governance. The party that would end up winning the most seats, however, the Labour Front, made independence a key issue, promising immediate self-governance. The Labour Front would join with 2 smaller parties to become the first elected government of Singapore, led by David Marshall, a former lawyer. The first issue that Marshall will have to face will be the Hockley riots and strike. The Hockley Bus Company saw many of its workers joining the Singapore Workers' Bus Union in early 1955. Management would prevent them from going to union meetings, and when they attempted sudden strike, all 229 members of the union were fired. They would begin protesting by halting bus services, and were quickly joined by Chinese students. Marshall would negotiate a government review into conditions and an agreement in which 1/3 of buses could be run by those in the Singapore's Workers' Bus Union. This would only last 3 days, however, when union members would return to the streets. When they did not disperse, water guns would be shot at them, and they responded violently. 4 would be killed and 26 injured the next day when the crowd began to riot. This would affect David Marshall's political career, who would go to London a year later to begin talks for self-governance. he was unable to agree with the British on the terms for internal security. Marshall wanted internal security to be headed by a council which would see its chairman be from his government, while the British wanted the chairperson to be from the British government. The British fears of internal security was no doubt influenced by what they saw as weak governance during the Hockley riots. David Marshall resigned as chief minister on the 6th of August 1956 and was replaced by Lim Yew Hock, who would successfully negotiate self-governance 2 years later. With self-governance fully implemented in 1959, Singapore would see symbolic and political changes. Symbolically, the island would get its own national anthem, Majulah Singapura, as well as a flag and coat of arms. Politically, it would see the first elections in which the winning government would control all of Singapore excluding defense. The election would be won by the People's Action Party, or PAP, who won 43 of 51 seats. In the next 4 years, the PAP government would show their ability to govern, most notably with the creation of the Housing and Development Board, which would build 54,000 homes in 5 years. To gain independence, however, the British believed Singapore needed to merge with the new state of Malaya. The Malayan government would only support merger if Sarawak and northern Borneo would join the new state to ensure a majority Malay population. When this was agreed in 1961, Malaya announced its support of merger. There were two key reasons for merger. The first was economic. As Singapore lacked any natural resources, it was seen as economically inviable. As part of this new state, however, Singapore could become the port of call to export the many products of the Malaysian hinterland. The second was political. The British feared that Singapore would become communist if it did not join Malaya. This fear was worsened when tensions over merger led to the PAP splitting and the creation of the Bahasa Socialist movement, which saw the British further distrust Singapore as they saw this movement as quasi-communist. The Barisan Socialist would deem merger a fake merger, as Singaporean citizens would be unable to vote in Malayan elections and would only get 15 seats, while proportionally they should have gotten 24. For the next year, the government would release pamphlets such as this one to convince the people for merger, and the Prime Minister would address the nation with 12 radio talks.
In this series of broadcasts, I hope to tell you what merger means, why it's good for all of us.
In September of 1962, Singapore voted on merger. 70% of the population would vote for merger on the government's terms, while 25% would cast blank votes as the Barisan Socialist had demanded. The referendum was criticized by David Marshall and the Barisan Socialist for not giving an option that rejected merger. Singapore would join the new state of Malaysia on the 16th of September 1963, a little over a year after the referendum. The new nation would be riddled with economic and political difficulties. Economically, the island of Singapore would be expected to pay 39.8% of the nation's taxes, despite only accounting for 17% of the population. Common market would also never materialize. Politically, both the PAP and UNMO, the ruling party of Malaya, competed in each other's elections to disappointing results. After failing to win any seats in the 1963 Singapore election, some extremist factions of UNMO would claim that the PAP was oppressing the Malay of Singapore. This political tension would lead to two race riots in June and September of 1964, leading to the combined deaths of 36. The straw that broke the camel's back was the PAP's creation of a coalition calling for a Malaysia. Secret negotiations would begin on the terms for Singapore to leave Malaysia. When Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Toh Chin Che, refused to sign the document, Tunku Abdul Rahman, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, would send him this letter, stating that I find that in the interest of our friendship and the peace and security of Malaysia as a whole, there is no other way out. On the 9th of August 1965, Singaporeans would wake up to shocking news. Even the Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, would say this at a press conference that day.
For me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life, you see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysia, in merger and the unity of these two territories. You know, as a people connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship, would you mind if we stop for a while?
Lee would sign this document promising Singapore
Singapore shall forever be a sovereign, democratic, independent nation founded upon the principles of liberty and justice, and ever seeking the welfare and happiness of a people in a more just and equal society.
And so, in 24 years, Singapore went from a British colony to being occupied to the Japanese, again a British colony, self-governance, a new state in Malaysia, and an independent republic. Thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing.